Okay, this review is about oblique moods. So, what are oblique moods? Well, first of all, unlike indicatives, they only have tense in relation to the main verb of the sentence. What we're talking about when I mention oblique moods are the subjunctive, the infinitive, and the participle. And what I'm going to try to do here is show you ways that they are like each other in translation. Okay, so the three time relationships you should already be aware of. There's time before or completed aspect, there's same time or contemporaneous aspect, and then there's time after, which is the future. Right? The verbs that tell you time before are the perfect infinitive, the perfect participle, the perfect and pluperfect subjunctive, depending on sequence. Verbs at the same time are the present infinitive, the present participle, present and imperfect subjunctives, and time after are the future infinitive, future participle, present and imperfect subjunctive, and sometimes the future periphrastic subjunctive. That's in indirect questions. All right. So verbs at the same time. When we translate verbs at the same time, they're going to sound either like a present or an imperfect, depending on the tense of the main verb. Okay, so you have a present active participle here. When our men, not proceeding very far, since our men, not proceeding very far, when our men, not proceeding very far, did not dare to follow the enemy, meanwhile 6 legions which had come first began to fortify the camp. Right? And koiperunt there is your introductory verb. Or, if you translate it like a relative clause, since our men who were not proceeding very far did not dare, blah, blah, blah. Right? So it sounds like an imperfect if we make it into a relative clause, but we don't have to do that. Right? In primary sequence, I changed audeant to audeant, and koiperunt to incipiunt. Since our men, not proceeding very far, do not dare, or since our men who are not proceeding very far do not dare. Okay, so same time in the present participle. We look at the infinitive and indirect statement, it works in the exact same way. Here's a verb in secondary sequence. He discovered thus, there was no access to them for the merchants. Okay, if we now switch to indirect statements, to subjunctives in cum clauses and indirect statements. Here's another example from Caesar. When several from the Belgian prisoners of war and the remaining Gauls, having followed Caesar, were making a journey together. So your main verb is pervenerunt. Right? Certain ones came at night to the Nervii, and then facerent is same time because it's imperfect subjunctive in a secondary sequence cum clause. So we translate it as if it were an imperfect indicative. He discovered thus. They allowed nothing of wine and the remaining things pertaining to luxury to be brought in because they considered that by those things their minds grew weak and their virtue was slackened. Here we have a relative clause within indirect statement, and so we're going to translate it again like an imperfect indicative because it's happening at the same time as reperiebat, the verb which introduces the indirect statement. So that's so much for same time. Time before sound like perfects in primary sequence and like pluperfects in secondary sequence. So here we have perfect passive participles in an ablative absolute. These men having been handed over and all the weapons having been gathered from the town. Right? Your main verb is pervenit, and traditis and collatis are prior action, time before pervenit. Or when these men had been handed over and all the weapons had been gathered. If you translate with when, since, or although, like you can do with an ablative absolute, then you have to make them sound pluperfect. right? You have a perfect active participle in secondary sequence, which we've already seen. Several men, having followed Caesar, were making a journey together. Secuti is prior to Focarent. There it is. Or you could say, who had followed Caesar, and make it sound pluperfect, because it's prior action in a secondary sequence sentence. All right, carrying on with this, we're looking at perfect infinitives in indirect statement. Right? He discovered, first of all, here's a present infinitive, that the Sabis River was not farther away from the camp than 10 miles. Across that river, all of the Nervii had settled and were awaiting the coming there of the Romans there. Okay, so they had settled prior action and were awaiting contemporaneous action. Perfect subjunctives in primary sequence and pluperfect subjunctives in secondary sequence, cum clauses and modal attraction are the same. So here's an example of, again, secondary sequence in a cum clause. When he had made a journey through their territory for 3 days, he discovered Vicisset is prior to inviniebat. There's the English. And here's another example. He discovered that the Nervii were scolding and accusing the remaining Belgians because they had surrendered themselves to the Roman people and thrown away the virtue of their fathers. All right, and finally, time after. Apparently it all comes up at once here. This is the future participle. You can translate it about to, or you can use will in primary sequence and would in secondary sequence. So here, do not refuse tears to the inscription, O you who are about to die, O you who will die. Or if we translate this, we turn this into a secondary sequence idea. The man who was about to die soon, or who would die soon, did not deny tears to the inscription. And we can see this in a future infinitive and indirect statement where we use would. Reperiebat is the main verb. Misuros and akepturos are time after. So he discovered that they were swearing that they would not send lieutenants, nor would accept any condition of peace. And when we look at the subjunctive, there are many different things that happen here. Right? Sometimes you can use a present and imperfect subjunctive to convey time after in something like a purpose clause or an indirect command, which are always going to be about time after. And so there's a purpose clause. He sends explorers and centurions to choose, or who would choose, but to choose a suitable place for the camp. But in indirect questions, you use the future periphrastic subjunctive, which is the future participle plus the correct form of the subjunctive. So he asks what I will do, rogat quid facturus sim, and he asked what I would do, rogavit quid facturus essem. Okay, so the basic relationships here, the participles, infinitives, and some subjunctives, especially in cum clauses and modal attraction and indirect questions, work in the same way. Same time, time before, time after. Primary sequence, indirect statement, and subjunctive clauses, same time verbs sound like presents. Right? And in secondary sequence, same time verbs sound imperfect. Time before verbs sound perfect in primary sequence and pluperfect in secondary sequence. And as I have, time after sounds future in primary and is translated with would in secondary. And now the difference with participles here is that you don't necessarily always need to think this through, because you can always translate a participle verbing, having verbed, or having been verbed, or about to verb, or about to be verbed. You don't have to ever translate it as a relative clause, but if you do, then you have to get the time sequences right. Hope this was helpful. I think this is the end.